Earlier this year, we posted a video all about the worst weed we've encountered in our deep mulch garden. Around here, it's known as quackgrass, but in other parts of the world, it goes by many other names, like witchgrass, couchgrass, twitchgrass, and the very appropriate devil's grass. Now, after reading through your comments, it sounds like we're not the only ones who've gone to battle with this worthy foe. And so we figured it might be somewhat cathartic for all of us, in an admittedly medieval sort of way, if we were to chop some of that quackgrass into tiny pieces and explore its claimed edibility. My hope is that if it tastes good, we might be able to upgrade this weed from horrible pest to helpful volunteer. But for context, it's probably a good idea to watch that initial video first, so I've placed a link in the description. But as usual, here's a really quick recap of the relevant parts. According to the Ontario Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Rural Affairs, quackgrass is one of the 3 most serious weeds around the world, because it infests 37 different crops in 65 different countries. Here in Canada, it's estimated that 56% of farmland has quackgrass present, and unfortunately, its presence, if left untreated, can spell disaster for the farmer. For example, it can effectively reduce crop yields by as much as 85% and decrease soil nutrients by over half. Plus, quackgrass is also alleliopathic, meaning that it releases biochemicals that inhibit the growth of your nearby veggies. And as if all that wasn't bad enough, quackgrass is also incredibly prolific, reproducing both sexually with seeds and vegetatively with rhizomes, the latter of which being the true secret weapon. You see, rhizomes are horizontal stems that grow just below the surface, weaving their way through the competition and looking for a suitable place to sprout a whole new plant. Then, once the new plant is established, the rhizome remains like a support network, allowing energy and nutrients to be stored and shared with neighboring plants as needed. So, quackgrass rhizomes are bad news, which in itself is bad news because quackgrass is also really good at growing them. In fact, it's been recorded that a single plant can produce 154 meters worth. That's over 500 feet. And from those rhizomes, a single plant can sprout over 200 daughter plants, meaning that if you're not careful, a stealthy invasion can be launched from outside your garden and completely avoid detection until it's too late. And you know what? It gets even worse, because once you have it, it's nearly impossible to get rid of it. Sure, you can pull the stuff, but if even a tiny section of rhizome is left in the soil, that can be all that it takes to get the whole mess started all over again. Look, I could easily go on and on about this horrible weed for over 20 minutes, but I think you get the point. From a gardening perspective, quackgrass sucks, and if you can't beat it, we might as well eat it. So, from what we've read, most of the over 12,000 members of the grass family are non-toxic to humans, meaning that for most people, grass can be consumed without any major health effects. However, it's also really important that I stress the fact that we are not doctors, toxicologists, or wild edible experts. So, if ever you choose to forage for food in nature, please make sure you do your own research first. Plus, I should also point out that just because something is technically edible doesn't necessarily mean that it's desirable. For example, corn, wheat, and rice are 3 of the world's most important food staples. And as a side note, they all also just happen to be types of grasses. However, we typically only consume their seeds. Whereas if we were to attempt to eat the leaves, stems, or roots of these plants, unless harvested when very young, we'd probably find them pretty difficult to chew and nearly impossible to digest. And one of the main reasons for that is the high amount of cellulose found in most parts of the grass plant. You see, cellulose is a type of fiber that makes up the bulk of a plant's cellular walls, and is therefore one of the main reasons for a plant's strength and rigidity. Think of trees, for instance, because it's the cellulose that makes them so woody. But while cellulose is odorless, tasteless, and non-toxic, its woodiness also makes it very difficult to break down, without any specialized digestive equipment. For example, animals like cows, goats, deer, and giraffes all regurgitate their food after swallowing, so that they can gnaw away at it a second time. But extra chewing isn't the only adaptation used to break down cellulose, because they also take advantage of the microbes in their complex multi-chambered stomachs to ferment the fibrous plant material so that they can eventually extract its nutrients. And that's why most parts of the grass plant are considered inedible for humans, even though we can technically eat it. We just don't have any of the necessary equipment to digest it sufficiently. However, I'm pleased to announce that the one edible exception is the very thing that makes quackgrass such a pain in the butt for gardeners: the rhizomes. Because throughout history, people around the world have discovered that quackgrass rhizomes can be consumed as a nutritious food supplement, and even as a medicinal herb. For example, during periods of scarcity, dried rhizomes can be ground up and used along with wheat flour in bread recipes. Plus, they can be boiled down to produce a sweet syrup, which can in turn be used to make beer. And they can even be roasted as a coffee substitute. But for its medicinal uses, most people seem to recommend preparing it as a form of tea. And that's what we'll be trying today. Not because we need the medicine, but rather because it sounds a whole lot easier than baking a loaf of bread. Maybe next time. So to start off, we first need to harvest some quackgrass. But as luck would have it, that's something we do often anyway. Because as you can see, this bed has been invaded by grass plants from the adjacent sod-covered path. So part of our fall cleanup typically includes pulling these weeds and then covering the area with a fresh layer of old hay. But as a first step, we found that it's best to fully expose the problem by removing the remnants of last year's mulch with one of these hand cultivators. Fingers work well too, of course, but these seem to be quicker and do a better job of clearing around the grass without accidentally breaking off any of the stems. And besides, depending on the size of your invasion, your hands are likely to get a decent workout anyway, so we might as well give them a break whenever possible. But now that the old mulch is out of the way, our next step is to begin carefully digging out the rhizomes. And once again, we found that a cultivator comes in pretty handy, because the tines do a great job of loosening up the soil around the plant without accidentally breaking anything underneath. But once everything is loosened up, it becomes pretty easy to trace along the thick white stems with your fingers. Then, by gently working your way along the length, you can eventually find the end, either at a new shoot just waiting to emerge, or where it joins to the next fully established plant. And if you're really careful, you can even pull out several plants all at once, each connected by their little rhizome support network. And I must say, there's something really satisfying about doing this, and we often compete to see who can pull out the longest rhizome without breaking it. Then, after a few minutes, once the area is clear and we've collected a good handful of quackgrass, we'll shake off as much of the dirt as possible and then head inside. But don't forget to recover your soil with mulch first. Once in the kitchen, I think we should probably give these a thorough rinse in the sink, just to get the rest of the dirt off. Then we'll quickly remove the leaves and other bits until all we're left with are the actual rhizomes. And at this point, we can take a closer look at those nodes and notice how most of them have sprouted small roots. Don't forget, though we often think of them as such, the rhizomes are not roots. They're stems that just happen to grow underground. So when one of them finds a suitable location to sprout a whole new plant, it's one of these nodes that does the actual sprouting, which is why some people also refer to these as growth points. But from what we've read, the terminal bud, or the primary growth point at the tip of the stem, produces a hormone that prevents the rest of the nodes from sprouting new plants out of turn. But if the terminal bud is severed, the rest of the nodes are then stimulated into action. And having these small roots already in place makes the establishment of new daughter plants all that much easier. Anyway, since we're making rhizome tea and not root tea, our next step will be the removal of each of these nodes, until all we're left with are the short sections between them, called internodes. These are the most edible bits, and all the rest can be discarded. Oh, and if you're curious about their flavor, like I was, then now would be a good time to give them a taste. But as soon as you take your first nibble, you'll likely notice right away just how woody that cellulose is. So trying to eat these raw and unprocessed would be pretty difficult. But the flavor is mildly sweet, very similar to chewing on a piece of grass in the field. But if you've never done that, it mostly tastes exactly how you'd expect grass to taste. So take that for what you will. Anyway, now we need to dry these things. I'll be using a dehydrator because we happen to have one, but I'd imagine you could also use an oven on its lowest setting, or even just let them air dry for a few days. But either way, once they're hard and crispy, we're ready to make some tea. Now, I wasn't able to find any exact recipes for this, but it seems like a couple of heaping teaspoons of dried rhizomes is about what you'll want for a standard mug. I also decided to crumble them up a bit, but that may not be necessary. Then pour in a cup of boiling water and let it steep for about 10 minutes. But while we wait, let's quickly go over some of the health claims of this so-called medicinal herb. However, I'd also like to once again quickly point out that we're not doctors and can't verify any of these claims ourselves. So if you're planning to use this or any other natural remedy as a medicine, please consult an actual health expert first. We're sharing this information for the sake of interest only, not as medical advice. Anyway, from what we've read, quackgrass is a natural diuretic and can be used to treat various conditions from nephritis to urinary incontinence. It's also claimed to be useful for the treatment of acne, rheumatism, gallstones, enlarged prostate, and even syphilis. Some suggest that it can be used to purify blood, treat jaundice, stimulate the gastrointestinal system, and bring down a fever. Plus, apparently it's helpful for gout, too. So that's a lot of supposed benefits, but does it taste good? Let's find out. After steeping, many of the rhizome pieces had sunk to the bottom of the mug, but otherwise the appearance of the water remained pretty much unchanged. However, any concerns that nothing had happened were quickly dispelled as soon as we took a sniff. The scent was subtle but unmistakably grass-like, not unpleasant in any way, but not immediately drawing me in for my first sip either. However, once I eventually got up the nerve, the flavor was very similar to that of the fresh rhizome piece. If I were a wine or coffee connoisseur, I might describe it as a light-bodied tea with a short finish, low acidity, and a hint of earthy undertones. But since I'm not, I'd instead say to picture the taste of lettuce, and then imagine it as a tea. That's not perfectly accurate, but it's pretty close. Paula, on the other hand, described it as a cross between a weak green tea and jasmine tea. But either way, neither of us disliked it and would happily drink it again, just maybe not right away. So now that we've tried this once, let's quickly chat about some of the things we might do differently next time. First of all, I now realize that to make it worth my energy, I should have harvested a lot more rhizomes than I originally expected. By the time you cut off all the leaves, stems, and nodes, the actual usable bits don't really amount to much. In fact, by the time I was done, all I had left was little more than the 2 teaspoons needed for a single cup of tea. And along those same lines, I'm wondering if it was actually necessary to remove the nodes first. The little bit of information I could find online all suggested removing the roots, so I figured the quickest way would be to chop the nodes out as well. However, if the little roots around the growth points are non-toxic and of a similar flavor to the rhizomes, then honestly, I think I might try to just leave them in next time. It would easily cut the processing time in half and leave me with a lot more tea material to work with afterward. And speaking of saving time, it also seems a little bit silly to have dehydrated all of those rhizome bits, only to then immediately rehydrate them in boiling water. So I'm curious if it would have worked the same if I just steeped the fresh rhizomes instead. Dehydrating is obviously a great way to prep the rhizomes for long-term storage, but if I only wanted a single cup, I could have saved about a day by just using them fresh. So if any of you are herbal tea experts, maybe you can leave me a comment with your thoughts. But either way, I'm really glad we decided to give this a go. Quackgrass tea may not replace our morning coffee anytime soon, but the more we learn about the so-called weeds around us, the more we might start to appreciate their presence. And anything that turns an enemy into a friend is something worth keeping in the back of the old mental garden shed. Who knows when it might come in handy in the future. But in the meantime, thanks for watching, and we'll see you soon.